Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 27 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's pretty broad selection of classics primarily, with the occasional vintage car thrown in there as well. And many of these vehicles are, in fact most of them are road vehicles, and some of them are of course race cars, classic race cars. And of the classic car selection, not very many of them are race cars. The race cars that we do have though in the classic category tend to be pretty outstanding vehicles. The GT40, the Chaparral 2J and various others are really desirable vehicles. This particular vehicle is as collectible, I would say, as any of the other classic race cars. It may not have the huge price of them, but it's certainly just as great a collector's piece, and it's a very different approach to racing that many of the other cars take. One of the things, of course, that made Japan really notable in classic racing initially was that they approached the concept of speed in a different way to most of the other teams. Incidentally, also a similar method to that which Lotus used in their classic racing, and that is to focus more on being small, nimble and lightweight rather than having just sheer power. This car is pretty much the epitome of that as far as the classic Japanese race cars on Gran Turismo are concerned. The car is a Honda, of course, and it's based on the S800, which I think is a great looking car anyway. It's an ultra small sports car, really tiny engine, not very much power, all things considered, but just really nice to look at and really fun to drive. And also a great starting point for, in effect, a penny racer, a tiny racing car. And boy is this car fun. This is, I would say, one of the most fun race cars, classic or otherwise, in the entire game. You don't need to race this thing to enjoy it, just flying around the track will give you so much enjoyment. The handling on this thing, it's just a pleasure to use. It's beginner friendly, it's very easy to drive, you can take corners at incredible speeds because of how small and light it is, and even though it doesn't have obviously a huge amount of power to work with a vehicle like this you don't need a huge amount of power. It's just so light and small that your average speed can easily be as high as a vehicle with far more power, especially with a driver who's not afraid to push the car much harder than you would usually be able to, especially in a classic. Now, as far as its specs go, you're looking at an 845cc engine. It's turbochargeable up to an amazing 156 horsepower, which isn't a lot, but it kind of is at the same time. For the engine, that's very decent. Compared to other race cars, of course, not so much. As far as where it produces its power and torque, it's a screamer. Over 11,000 RPM for peak power and peak torque, so the engine really does like to be worked hard, and it's not really too surprising that it's a peaky engine given how small it is. As far as torque, it doesn't have all that much, but that's not going to surprise anyone. 74 foot-pounds, so overall the horsepower and torque, a little more so the power in fact, is very similar to the way a motorbike engine would feel. Very high revving, high power, not as much torque. Now compared to a bike engine, this car has quite a lot of torque, but it's a very similar characteristic overall in the way it drives. As far as weight, it's perhaps not quite as light as you might think. You're probably expecting somewhere around 550 kilos, or I certainly would be at least. It does weigh a little bit more than that, 627, but it's still certainly not heavy. As far as horsepower per tonne, well, you don't have a huge amount of power to build up the horsepower per tonne with, but due to the fact that the weight is nice and low, you're still putting out just under 250 horsepower per tonne, which isn't too bad, given that you've only got 156 horsepower anyway. And, very notably about this vehicle, the PP is really low. 444 pp is the maximum tuned level of the S800. That is so low, that's barely the level that most road cars in the game can get to, even the lower ones. But the fact that the PP is so low on what is an official racing vehicle can be quite useful, certainly in racing, which, as I've mentioned with some other cars before, just don't allow your rivals to use maybe significantly more power. And this track that we're on at the moment is a perfect example of that. You just don't have the space and straights to really use a huge amount of power, so you can use all of the advantages of this car so well on a twisty track. And it's a shame actually, because many of the tracks that this car is brilliant for aren't actually featured on the game anymore. Tracks such as Città d'Aria and the Amalfi Coast track, they were perfect for this car. Tracks which are just so tight that you cannot use a huge amount of power or a big car. They just get stuck. Tracks which are similar to that are still available on the game. You've got Monaco, London for instance, but many of them aren't there anymore. That's a shame, and hopefully they'll change that in the future. But for now at least, there are some tracks that this car can be very, very useful for. Now, I wouldn't recommend buying it just as a race car in that strict sense. If you're buying it just to race with, then you may find it to be a little bit too niched, because there aren't many situations where it will actually dominate. But under the right circumstances, it definitely can give you a victory against the right opponents. And although it's pretty expensive if you compare its spec to what you actually get, 250 grand, I would definitely recommend buying this car. You don't really even need to be a classic fan. It's just a really enjoyable, characterful little car. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.